Alright, so today as part of my alternate history series, I have What If D-Day Failed, which would have been a pretty big deal if it did. With any alternate history, I'm going to look at the divergence point and see the real plausibility of it, and I'm also going to assess the outcome that this person has put forth as a result of the change. How would this alternate world look like? We can never really know for sure, but using information and knowledge on a certain topic, we can make guesses. So that's what I'll be doing. So let's go ahead and dive right in.
The Second Great War, as most of us know, brought clashing in a variety of ways, perhaps the mightiest states the world had ever seen. The devastating dynamo that was the German war machine pressing forward against the immense titan which was the Soviet Union. The Germans also needing to contend with the globe-sprawling British Empire and rising superpower of the United States, all of whom remained very weary of one another's ambitions. The French, who had initially challenged Germany's expansion alongside Britain, were quickly knocked out of the game in a swift German invasion, leaving behind only ragtag resistance forces and...
Just as a note, 6 weeks from the point of German invasion to the point of French surrender. 6 weeks. If you really want to know how effective the Germans were at the beginning of the war. 6 weeks. Poland took 9 weeks. I believe 9. Might have been 8. I think it was 9. So yeah, they were pretty good at war.
And minor British assets stationed on the continent, before themselves being driven out not only there, but throughout the whole of the mainland, from Norway to Greece. Britain would thus be forced to combat Germany by sea, by air, and in far-off lands, doing whatever possible to hinder German success. But beyond merely impeding German efforts, the British would remain determined to regain continental ground, and specifically to liberate France. As the Germans grew confident of Britain's limitations, but anxious of the Soviets' rising capabilities, so was attention shifted eastward, bringing the formerly opposed British and Soviets to a mutual understanding through sheer necessity. The war would wear hard on the USSR, whilst Britain had yet to break the mainland, even now with American support. Although victories had been achieved in North Africa and other parts of the Near East, such had not been sufficient to slow Germany's eastward advance, leading Stalin to demand of his allies that a western front be opened to mitigate the great strain placed upon the Soviet Union. By 1943, ground had finally been taken in Italy, who soon surrendered only to come under German occupation. Geography and a series of German defensive lines would make Allied advance through the peninsula a great challenge, thus a quicker, more strategically significant front needed to be opened, and the answer would...
Yeah, so an interesting fact about the invasion of Italy and why it's not really very famous or well known is that initially it was actually very successful. The Allies landed and very quickly progressed up Italy and caused Italy to capitulate very quickly. However, when Italy fell, Germany moved in and they put their troops along the lines and fortified, and the Allies could not break the German line until 1945, until after D-Day. May have been late 44, I believe it was 45. But it was after D-Day. So after the front had been opened in France and after the push of Soviet troops through Poland, only then were they actually able to break through. The failure of Italy there sort of adds to the running joke about how bad Italy really was in the war. A lot of it just came out of the fact that a lot of Italians didn't want to fight. A lot of soldiers didn't really want to fight. So they weren't as well trained, they weren't as well organized, and they did not have the drive. But yeah, it would have been a wild success had the Germans all stepped in. The Allies kind of knew that, and they pushed as hard as they could, as fast as they could, and they managed to take quite a bit. I think they took about half the peninsula. But yeah, so this was actually initially a wild success until Germany moved in and fortified, which happens when Germany decides to do something, especially in a world war.
Finally present itself as an invasion of the French beaches of Normandy, an effort commonly known as Operation Overlord, or simply D-Day. The Normandy invasions proved to be a great turning point in the conflict, not only in a strategic sense, but in boosting Western morale as well. The seeming impenetrable Atlantic wall meant to lock out the British had been broken. The Germans, no longer secure on their western front, struggled to hold off advancing armies from east and west. and Vichy France was abandoned so that troops could remobilize closer to the German border, in essence surrendering the French south to the Allies. While Italy might have held off an Allied invasion of Germany for another year or two, it was clear to quite a few in the German high command that if northern France was successfully taken, the war would certainly be lost, and so it had been. The Allies of the West and East converging upon Berlin some months later, defeating Germany and bringing the European theater of the war to a close. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the D-Day invasion had failed? It hadn't been an outcome far out of the realm of possibility. General Eisenhower even drafted a letter of regret in which he would assume full responsibility for the operation's failure if in fact things did not go according to plan. The Germans as well had long exaggerated the strength of the Atlantic Wall, which proved to be to their own detriment, as because Britain held air superiority, they were quite capable of evaluating German defenses beforehand, whilst many German commanders were simply lulled into a false sense of security as to the fortifications of the Western Front. The key exception had been General Erwin Rommel, who had been sent to inspect and improve upon current coastal defenses. He'd conclude that the Atlantic Wall was at best 18% finished, and hurried to install additional measures, although resources were in great part siphoned off to other areas.
So there's actually an interesting story that comes out of this. When Rommel was first put in charge of the construction of the Atlantic Wall, he wasn't the original general in charge. I forget who it was that was, but it was someone far less important than Rommel, at least in terms of historical view. Rommel was put in charge, and when he showed up to inspect the wall, instead he just found a bunch of soldiers playing soccer and some very loose fortifications, not even really, nothing concrete, literally nothing concrete. It was in trenches, dugouts, that sort of thing. And he was completely taken aback by the whole thing. First of all, he punished the soldiers for just sticking around and playing soccer, and really quickly got everybody in shape, all the soldiers that were along the line, to the point of even threatening to send them to the Eastern Front if they didn't, because while they were comrades and fighting against the Soviets in horrible conditions, these guys were playing soccer. And Rommel was known for being very blunt and actually honest with Hitler, whereas a lot of commanders, especially those within the SS, really weren't, or they would keep information from Hitler, hoping to make the decisions on their own and not have Hitler influence them. Rommel usually just blatantly told him as it was, created some strife between the two. But in this particular instance, it actually really benefits Hitler, because Hitler didn't know that the Atlantic Wall wasn't being built the way he ordered. He had no idea. He thought that it was being built. Everyone kept saying, yeah, it's being built, it's fine. It wasn't. There weren't enough resources, wasn't enough manpower, and the soldiers weren't being trained, and they were basically wide open to an actual assault. Had the Allies been ready sooner, it would have been even more of a success. But the Germans were pretty lucky that it took the Allies so long to get an invasion force together and to train for something like this, because Rommel really cracked down hard. And the speed of building the fortifications definitely increased. As he's mentioning here, there was a shortage of resources and manpower to do that because of the Eastern Front, but there was definitely an increase of it. Now those trenches and dugouts were replaced with actual concrete fortifications with cannons and all sorts of weapons, and they were given more soldiers to protect these areas. There were still massive gaps within the Atlantic Wall, but it had improved significantly, and it was Rommel that did that. But yeah, when he first showed up, they were literally playing soccer, and he was not happy after fighting in Africa and all these places. He wasn't happy.
Of the war. Germany also had an opportunity to strategically station a number of tank divisions in preparation for a crushing counterattack. However, these forces had been split three ways, with only one division actually in place to counterattack on the first day. We'll assume things go a bit differently this time, be it through a more effective fortification of the Atlantic Wall or some other factor which leaves the Allies at a disadvantage, by some means the invasion is simply repelled. The Allies immediately feel the impact of this loss as plans are scrapped and internal divides grow wider. Some have assumed that given the tremendous loss of life even in our own timeline, a defeat at Normandy would lead an ashamed General Eisenhower to resign, something backed up not only by the letter in which he assumed full responsibility for the outcome, but by the fact that he had been losing his patience with Britain and had threatened on 2 occasions to return to the US. Whether or not Eisenhower does resign, the severity of this loss does certainly follow him in his post-war years, costing him any major chance of winning the presidency in 1952. Speaking of presidency, this loss would also harm Roosevelt during the 1944 election, just some months after the planned invasion. While Roosevelt is still likely to defeat Dewey simply based on historic public support for an incumbent president during wartime, he does do so by a much narrower margin, potentially setting Dewey up for a victory in '48 when he goes up against Roosevelt's former Vice President Truman. Although there had been a mutual understanding of Normandy's value, the operation had greater support from Roosevelt than it did Churchill, who instead favored attacking the Axis from the more vulnerable South, a region he termed Europe's soft underbelly. It was because of this that Operation Overlord, originally Operation Sledgehammer, was meant to coincide with Operation Anvil, later renamed Operation Dragoon. As the names might suggest, the plan had been to capture southern French ports to establish a sturdy base, and to come down upon German forces through an overwhelming northern push, like a hammer striking metal on an anvil. Logistic issues made the coinciding plans impossible, and so Dragoon was carried out sometime following Overlord as a standalone operation. In our world, the effectiveness of Operation Overlord demanded that Germany pull the majority of its forces in the south to instead hold off the advancing Allies. Thus, when Dragoon was carried out in the south, it was met with relatively little resistance and proved an overwhelming success. However, because the Allies are repelled in the north, the south remains well supplied, meaning if Dragoon is carried out, it could still prove a disaster for Britain, whose population had already been, as Churchill himself supposedly put it, running on fumes. Considering the great toll the failed Normandy invasion had brought, Britain may hesitate to attempt a second invasion even in the less defended south. Dragoon had, after all, been a compromise between the US and UK as to an invasion site, but if we assume that 1. American involvement would be compromised by Eisenhower's departure, and 2. Britain is less willing to attack a risky target, the outcome might instead be to launch an invasion of the oil-rich Balkans from Italy, as Churchill had originally planned. Stalin strongly opposed this as he asserted it would intrude upon his sphere of influence. However, this was precisely the reason Churchill insisted on such an operation, understanding that he could cut Germany off from petroleum assets and thus significantly weaken them, as well as place the West in a more advantageous negotiating position with the Soviets post-war. It's reasonable to assume this invasion would go along much easier than its alternatives. However, the matter isn't so much if it can be done successfully, but what reaction the USSR might have to it. If we assume the British invasion of the Balkans takes place around the same time Dragoon was carried out in our world, this would lead the British to directly encounter Soviet troops along the eastern Serbian border, just as Bulgaria and Romania fell under Eastern occupation. The plan at that point would be to advance northward toward Austria and Hungary before pressing forward toward Berlin. This change of strategy would no doubt drive divides between the Allies, including the US and UK. Roosevelt, not taking kindly to Churchill's domineering oversight, perhaps shifts attention toward the war in the Pacific instead of the Balkan campaign. If so, this would drastically slow Britain's advance, allowing Hungary and even Austria to fall to the Soviets, making the invasion ultimately pointless. Alternatively, as to not tread heavily on Stalin's toes, Churchill might instead opt to invest more heavily in aerial bombardment. Chief Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Arthur Harris, had been a strong believer that tactical bombing raids on German cities would ultimately bring about a surrender. As we know from our timeline, a German surrender did not come easy, and it's unlikely mere bombing raids would achieve a victory for Britain. However, there's much opportunity for this to have become perhaps one of the darkest outcomes for the war. By 1945, France is still under German occupation, and rockets continued to strike Britain even despite misinformation tactics which at least managed to keep many from striking London directly. The Soviets without Western support continued to advance slowly but surely, although the current pace might indicate another year or two before the war is over. Stalin, frustrated with the ineffectiveness of Britain, is no longer expected to remain within his sphere of influence, leaving Britain desperate for any alternative. In our world, Churchill had wrote to his military chiefs, quote, "I should be prepared to do anything that will hit the enemy in a murderous place. I may certainly have to ask you to support me in using poisonous gas." This proposal had been made exactly 1 month following the D-Day landings, and speaks quite a bit to the desperate state Churchill had already been in. He would write further, "We could drench the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany, and if we do it, let us do it 100%. His military chiefs initially rejected the proposition, fearing German retaliation in equal or greater scale, not to mention the public outrage that would come from such an action. Churchill, however, simply responded, quote, "I am not at all convinced by this negative report. The matter should be kept under review and brought up again when things get worse." Eventually, the consideration began to approach reality. An earlier initiative known as Operation Vegetarian, which involved infecting the German food supply with an anthrax bioweapon, was revived in the form of using anthrax bombs against 6 major German cities. The plot was only abandoned because by the time the bombs were ready, the war was nearly over. This time, things are different. Much like the US in the Pacific, the British are growing weary while their adversary remained unshaken. Bombing raids and invasion proved too slow a strategy, and so drastic measures were taken. Unlike Truman, there's much doubt over how hesitant Churchill would have been to unleash his own weapon of mass destruction. As far as he was concerned, there was little difference in using such weapons in this Great War, as earlier versions had been used in the prior Great War. As you might expect, the effects are devastating. The 6 German cities targeted are rendered uninhabitable, but this attack doesn't end the war just yet. It's believed that the Germans had, by 1945, stockpiled some 80,000 tons of chemical weapons in the event one of their opponents used WMDs first. Had Britain initiated this exchange, Germany would unleash its own arsenal of far deadlier agents against both Britain and the Soviets. It's not clear who would come out on top in the aftermath of such a situation, if the three would agree to a ceasefire and ultimately resolve issues diplomatically, or if the Soviets, through benefit of being so distant from the battlefield, might take advantage of the situation to exert influence over the weakened Britain and Germany, or perhaps Britain remains untouched as Germany is unable to effectively deliver their weapons overseas. Whatever the outcome, this would be one catastrophic possibility. But let's backtrack a bit and consider the British invasion of the Balkans once again. Let's assume that the US continues to back Britain just to ensure the Soviets don't overwhelm them completely and demand more than previously negotiated. Major oil fields in Romania, just as in our world, are still captured by the Soviets on account of proximity and an unwillingness to allow so close a state to fall under Western influence. This increased effort in the south may hinder Soviet advance in the north, but only minimally. Western efforts are in great part wasted in the Yugoslav region, which would have come under control of Tito's partisan forces. This does, however, allow for a British occupation of Albania before it fell to communist insurgents. The speedy victory in Yugoslavia also becomes a springboard from which to invade Austria and Hungary, aiming to sweep westward and retake Belgium and the Netherlands, whilst the Soviets approach Berlin, bringing the war to a close. While this plan of invading the Balkans just to circle back around to France might seem convoluted, it plays best to the strategy the Western Allies would have had to adopt. A march toward Berlin could be attempted, but given the pace at which the Soviets were closing in, it may prove a safer strategy to capture well ahead of where the Soviets might intend to expand. France couldn't be secured through direct invasion nor routing through Italy, and so rather than take France back before war's end, the West would simply need to block it off from Soviet access and return to finish the job once the war was over. Because of the southern route taken by the Allies, occupation zones are divided diagonally along a northeast-southwest line, with communist Yugoslavia being a key exception. The Yugoslavia of this world could end up divided in two, with a socialist republic along the coast and a kingdom more inland, simply because the Soviets are never able to link up with the partisans in this timeline due to Western occupation. Albania is also placed in a dual monarchy with Italy as to secure it from its larger neighbors, something which had originally been considered years prior, and which formed part of the official basis for their annexation by Italy in 1939. Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic are maintained within the Western Bloc, along with southern Germany, however at the cost of the Scandinavian countries, which came under Soviet occupation following efforts to neutralize their pro-German governments. Sweden, though neutral during the war, and Finland having earlier negotiated peace, would still fall under hefty Soviet influence and see favor for communist parties rise through both legal and social pressures. The delayed Western support of this alternate world also discourages the Soviets from major involvement against Japan, leaving the Pacific War to rest in great part upon American efforts. Now, it's been suggested by some that the impending threat of Soviet conquest had been what truly motivated the Japanese to surrender, and while there's partial truth to this, the strains which drove Japan to this desperate state came primarily from US actions. The Soviets breaking their pact of peace with Japan had been startling, as the Japanese North went largely undefended in order for resources to be diverted against the US, meaning Japan was woefully underprepared to fight in this new front. The Soviets had also captured one of Japan's last major resource hubs, leaving them without the means to fuel their war effort. You might even say that the USSR's entry into the war with Japan had been an Eastern equivalent to the D-Day invasion. That being said, Japan had been running on fumes since late 1944. Resources, manpower, and naval weaponry were nearly depleted. All possible courses of action appeared bleak, leading to much disagreement within the high command and restlessness from within the Japanese population. Something only escalated by the dropping of the atomic bombs, impending threat of American invasion, and an overall lack of preparation on the mainland islands. The military was tired, the people were tired, and even the emperor was tired. As one Japanese admiral had put it, the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, divine gifts. This way we don't have to say that we quit the war because of domestic circumstances. Given the lack of incentive, the Soviets might delay their invasion until the end of their peace pact with Japan, some 9 or so months after the invasion had begun in our world. The end result being that the US would occupy much of Japan's captured territories, with the exception of a few islands which Stalin had asserted claim to during the earlier conferences. Because the Soviets don't invade Japanese conquests in northern China, it remains outside of communist control, thus when the resumed Chinese Civil War begins, the communists are left without the safe haven provided to them by the USSR in the north, ultimately allowing China to return to nationalist rule. While the Soviets are now more strategically positioned within Europe, the Asiatic communist sphere which had emerged in our world never forms. Indochina may remain under French control for a time, although the US would certainly take an active stance against both British and French colonialism, much as in our world. The Roosevelt administration and its successors had pushed the anti-colonial agenda since the outbreak of the war, the US making clear plans for ensuring self-determination in all post-war countries, although Churchill for a time asserted that this would only be the case for states under Axis occupation. These plans likely wouldn't change even if we assume Dewey beats Truman in the '48 election, as Dewey represented the pro-internationalism moderate faction of the Republican Party, which would later come to form the Liberal Republicans. Britain and France, who are now in a more compromised position due to the USSR's expanded influence, are more reluctant to give up what were a tremendous source of wealth and resources, which would be direly needed to rebuild. We might imagine the US withholding aid from the Marshall Plan or imposing upon the two some form of economic penalty should they refuse. India, Morocco, Tunisia, and Indochina likely still break away. However, the two empires would grasp tightly upon the remaining territories, not trusting the US to fully ensure their security in the event of a Soviet attack, looking to each other instead. Without the industrious lands of northern Germany, France and the Benelux countries are short a major member of what would have been the European coal and steel community. This alternate timeline might see Britain assume a leading role in what Churchill once described as a United States of Europe, or perhaps merely a Franco-British Union, operating as a third faction in the Cold War which represented the interests of Europe free from both American and Soviet domination, as well as pursued the continued success of the imperial and colonial systems. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z.
Alright, so that was a lot of information, but I mean, anything to do with World War II usually has a lot of information, as there's a million things going on and a million factors involved in every decision. The outcomes of every decision really mattered in World War II more than many other conflicts, just because of the scale of everything and the immense amount of countries and everything that were involved. As far as plausibility goes of Normandy not happening, very high, actually. There was a lot of doubt on whether or not Normandy was going to be effective, if it was going to work, and even if they did land, how effective was it going to be in actually retaking France? Would they get stopped and be stuck in northern France, or would they actually be able to push the Germans back? The real success of Normandy, or the real miracle of the success of Normandy, is that it wasn't just the invasion that was successful, but it was every beachhead. So all the beachheads that were invaded were all successful, despite some of them being much more fortified and much more difficult to take than the rest. The Allies were able to take all of them. Had they not been able to take all of them, you would not have seen the same level of success as if they were able to maintain their beachheads. They would have to now fight along northern France more to open up more supply lines and bring in more troops. They would have been working a much more narrow area. really depending on which beachheads they take to determine sort of the success of it. Some were a little more vital than others. But the plan was to take a whole swath of them, and that whole connection of them was to be how they brought in supplies and everything. But what's really amazing is that they all worked. They were all successful, which I'm not sure that anyone was really expecting, but it was actually very successful. Now, as far as the outcome goes, now this is very hard to say, especially when talking about World War II. It's very hard to say. I tend to think that Eisenhower would have resigned. He was near his wit's end, and a failure of that magnitude, a failure of D-Day, would have been humiliating, and it would have been devastating. I think that he would have resigned, and someone else would have come in and taken over. Now, because of this, I don't think that the Allies pull off another invasion anytime soon. Definitely not in France. So another attack on southern France, unlikely. You may see a renewed effort to try and break the lines in Italy, but that would probably not be very successful. If they do break the lines, it probably doesn't fall up against another one, take some territory before getting stuck in another stalemate. As far as the Balkans go, that's a big if. Churchill really wanted to do it. He really wanted to go after the Balkans, but there was a lot of criticism of Churchill's decision to do this, desire to do this, mostly because of the failure of the Gallipoli invasion in World War I, in which he was Ministry of the Navy or something, Minister of the Navy of Britain, and so it was really his idea, and he was responsible for it all. And Gallipoli was an immense failure. It was absolutely devastating. Cost a lot of lives, and really they got nothing for it. It caused Churchill to have to resign his position and basically ruined his career. If World War II had not happened, Churchill probably would be a footnote in a book about World War One, at best, if they mention him at all. But he comes into it because of World War II. So I think that he would take a lot of criticism for wanting to go into the Balkans, and FDR really didn't want to step on the toes of Stalin. He was sort of a mediator between the two, because Stalin and Churchill really didn't like each other. Stalin was very adamantly against the West, no surprise there, but Churchill was also a very adamant anti-communist. He actually built his political career on anti-communism. It was only the threat of Nazism that he saw as a bigger evil. Other than that, communism was number 2 on his list of most evil things ever. So, between the failure of Gallipoli and his very clear motivation to undermine the Soviets, who were their ally and who they needed in order to win the war, I think he would have met a lot of very stiff resistance from not only FDR, but also any generals that were involved. If Eisenhower doesn't resign, and he's here at this point, he is probably going to threaten to resign if they go through with it. I think Eisenhower would have been staunchly opposed to the idea. So I don't think that an attack on the Balkans is very likely. He seems to be drawing at straws on that one. It makes the video a little more exciting to talk about it, and it really brings a whole new power dynamic to the division of Europe, but I just don't really see where it's going to happen. Now they did, liberate Greece, and they can push up from there, so there's definitely the possibility for them to push further up the Balkans from Greece, but for a full-on naval invasion, I'm not seeing it. I don't see it happening. There was a lot too much there was a lot of resistance to that idea for a number of reasons. course, Churchill had the final say, but even the King of England was not really on board. Now, as far as the use of chemical weapons goes, that I agree on. Absolutely, I think that Churchill would have ordered their use. And especially if Eisenhower has resigned at this point, Eisenhower would be opposed to it. But I don't think that he would have taken any real actions to stop it. He would have just, been kind of crumpy about the whole thing, but I don't think he would have actually stopped Britain from doing it. He probably would have just advocated that the United States not follow suit. Because the British did have a lot of chemical weapons stockpiled, and there was an intention to possibly use them if the things got bad enough. A lot of them were created in the event that Britain was invaded. They would use chemical weapons against the invaders because they would be that desperate. So that was really the main reason why they had them, but they also had developed them later on to bring the Germans to their knees in some way, because without the involvement of the Americans, Britain really didn't see a way of actually bringing Germany down without some drastic action. It wasn't until the Americans got involved in a war that now they saw that they could probably beat them more conventionally. One he doesn't mention, and actually surprises me, is the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is not designed to be used against Japan. That's not why it was built. It was built to be used against Nazi Germany. The Germans were working on a nuclear program, and that's what inspired the Americans to create their own. So the whole point was to build one that so hopefully you would get it first, and then you could use it on the Germans and end the war. You could just take out Berlin or somewhere else or multiple places and just end the war that way with a series of atomic bombings. The other hope is that even if the Germans manage to get one first, you'll be able to retaliate with your own and again bring the Germans down, because Germany would probably hit London, but they can't hit Washington, they can't hit anywhere in the United States because they don't have any means to reach it at this point. So the likelihood of them hitting the US is extremely low. Hitting UK is very high. That would be their target, that and probably Moscow. But in reality, there's also the argument, and I support this argument fully, that the Soviets never really needed the Allies, that they would have won the war on their own without another front, without the Allies going into Normandy or even Italy for that matter. That once the Battle of Stalingrad was over and the Soviets managed to get the upper hand and began building momentum, they never lost it. And that momentum would eventually bring them to Moscow. And I really, really think that absolutely they would have won the war without the help of the Allies. It would have cost them millions more lives, and it would have been absolutely devastating to both sides. It probably would have prolonged the war for a couple of years at least, but it would have, I think they would have actually done it without the Allies. There's not a lot of doubt in my mind. The Soviet war machine, between their manpower and their industrial capacity, along with the ability to capture oil fields and things like that from the Germans, so now they have the immense resources they need. They have everything they need to win this war. They just need to keep pushing, and eventually they're going to break. Now, if this happens, and I think this is the most likely scenario, is that the Allies don't land another invasion. They try to push through Italy harder and maybe up through Greece, but they don't actually manage to land another invasion. The USSR pushes forward, takes out Berlin on their own. Now, Stalin, feeling that he has done pretty much all the work here, completely reneges on any agreements he's made before, and he just takes all of Germany, Austria, the Balkans. He just takes it all, with the exception of the places that the Allies were already occupying. So he would he probably wouldn't get much of Italy. Maybe in the northern half tops, you might see a division of Italy that way, between north and south, with a communist north and a democratic south. Greece would still be democratic. Whatever other areas, maybe into Bulgaria or even Albania, had the Allies pushed that far from Greece, may have been democratic, but outside of that, I think Germany would have fallen completely under Soviet rule. They may obtain the Benelux, but I think that the British would have been pretty adamant about them not doing that and would have threatened war. The same thing goes with France. I think that they would protect Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and Luxembourg from the Soviets. But if the Soviets really wanted it, I'm not sure how much they could do to stop it outside of all-out war. I think they would have gone to war to protect France. Probably not the Benelux, but definitely would have protected France. So I don't see France falling under communist rule. But pretty much everything up to the French border and the border of the Benelux countries would have been communist. And the Nordic countries too, definitely. They would have had popular uprisings and things of that nature. There's no doubt about that. So I definitely agree on that. As far as now the Pacific theater goes, I agree that one of the biggest factors in the surrender of Japan was not the involvement of the Soviets. It was more the threat of a Soviet invasion of the homeland, because the Japanese didn't have much of an army on the homeland. Their navy was defeated and their air force was practically non-existent at this point. They knew an invasion was coming from the Americans. They were holding most of their troops were in China and Manchuria, and they were holding key positions to stop invasions there, but they simply could not get the troops back to Japan. The U.S. had taken control of the seas, and there was no way. So for the Soviets to enter the war and push down and distract it, I don't agree that it was a similar effect as D-Day, because yes, it pulled a lot of resources away from other areas, but those resources weren't really being used against the Americans, and it wouldn't have been used against the Americans had they invaded. The Japanese probably would have gotten some troops back into the mainland. They would have been desperate. They would have tried everything possible to do it, but I don't think they would have pulled enough to actually stop an invasion from being successful. The U.S. would have just poured. I think the initial invasion plans called for 1 million Marines in the first wave, which is insane. It's completely insane. It would have made D-Day look like nothing. So I think they were more afraid of the Soviets coming in and occupying and instilling communism than they were the Americans coming in and changing things, especially since at this point the Americans had, mostly under the advisement of MacArthur, had basically said, yeah, we're probably going to keep the emperor around. He just won't have any powers, but we're going to keep him there. The Soviets wouldn't have done that, and I think the Soviets were a bigger threat to Japanese culture than the Americans were, so they were more afraid of that. And there's definitely changes in Asia that if the Soviets didn't bother in Asia, then communist China probably doesn't win, and you don't see the Korean War, there's no Vietnam War, none of that. But overall, Europe would definitely look different. I disagree with the assessment on going to the Balkans. I just don't see the Allies trying it again. I think they're going to push through France and push into Italy. Not France, Greece. They're going to push through Greece and push through Italy, and that's where they're going to push. They're not going to try another invasion, especially if Eisenhower resigns. But they will use chemical weapons, and they will probably use atomic weapons at the same time, and try to just force the Germans to submit by just sheer power. Now, this is going to lead to retaliation from the Germans, and the Germans are going to use chemical weapons on the British, and it's going to be devastating on both sides, but I think that's what it's going to resort to. I do agree with that assessment. It's going to resort to that. Now, the Germans don't have atomic weapons, which is very good, but so they have no way of really retaliating against that. So I think the combination of chemical weapons and atomic weapons, and then the Soviets pushing closer to Berlin every day, would have broken the Germans. It's possible you would have seen an uprising against Hitler. I don't really know. There were already many uprisings against Hitler and assassination attempts that were all unsuccessful. Maybe one of them gets pulled off this time and the war ends earlier. But in any case, I don't think that the invasion of D-Day was going to be necessary to winning the war. It's more necessary into who gets what when the war is over and how long the war takes. I think the Soviets would have pulled it off, especially if the Americans and the British are using chemical and atomic weapons against them. So again, as far as plausibility goes, definitely plausible. I mean, there were so many factors that went into this. It was a miracle that they pulled it off. It really was. It's not to make light of their success or in any way, but it really was amazing that it was pulled off, because it's something that probably shouldn't have been able to be pulled off. But it was definitely a once in a million year kind of thing. But so with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the video. I really liked this video. I thought it was really good and a lot of information thrown at you. Like I said, World War II is like that. I'm going to end the video here. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you want me to take a look at, whether they're alternative history or regular history, then please put them in the comment section and I will look into them. And I will see you next time.